And now we're going to take a look at the Zhou Dynasty. This is the second dynasty of China that we're going to study in our exploration of early civilizations. Let's start by checking out the definition of government. What is government? First of all, it's the process of governing, especially the control and administration of public policy which provides for the needs of citizens. So we talked about the characteristics of civilization with all the other civilizations that we've looked at, and we know that well-organized central government is one of those. But for China, the concept of government is really important. They really sort of invented the concept of government, and they've been doing it longer than any other civilization that's around, because China has over 5,000 years of the world's longest lasting continuous civilization. Okay, to understand the concept of Chinese government, we have to understand also what's referred to as the mandate of heaven, or Tianming. And this is the idea that heaven sort of oversees everything that takes place on earth. Heaven and earth are interconnected, and what happens on earth is usually the result of some influence in heaven. Also keep in mind that the Chinese concept of heaven is not like that in the West, with the idea that what's up in heaven is sort of an exact representation of what goes on here. If there's an emperor on earth, there's an emperor in heaven. If there's a mailman on earth, there's probably a mailman up in heaven. So there's this sort of interconnectedness between what goes on up there and there. That's a very simple way of looking at it, but essentially that's the basic way to think about it. Okay, so it's a belief that heaven gives the right to rule. That's essentially what the mandate of heaven is. So if an emperor is going to be worthy of being the emperor, it's because heaven gives him the right to do it. That's the best definition to work with the mandate of heaven. Now, the ruler must be moral, ethical, and good. So those are three characteristics that heaven would expect from a ruler. Be moral, ethical, and good. In exchange, subjects are going to be loyal and obedient. In fact, a good moral and ethical emperor doesn't have to tell his subjects what to do. They will see that he's being good, moral, and ethical, and they will then follow in his footsteps. He'll be like a role model. And so they won't even have to told to be obedient. They just will be, because they recognize he's being moral, good, and ethical. Now, if he's bad, right, if there's bad leadership, that gives the people the right to rebel. So an emperor who's not moral, good, and ethical basically doesn't deserve the mandate, and therefore the people have the right to rebel against him. And this has happened numerous times in Chinese history, both in the ancient past and also in the more recent present. So again, the concept of mandate of heaven is be good, moral, and ethical. You deserve to rule. If you're bad and immoral and unethical, then you should be overthrown by the people. Okay, and who makes that possible? Heaven dictates that that's going to happen. Okay, so how do you lose the mandate? There are 4 ways you can lose it. By the way, this is a picture of the first emperor of China, who we will learn did not always do the best things that he should have done, and as a result lost the mandate. First of all, here's the 1 and 4. Weak, corrupt, or cruel leadership. Okay, so again, being immoral, not being good, being unethical, but being weak, corrupt, or cruel is one way in which you can lose the mandate. Also, natural disasters. Basically, earthquakes, floods, and famines are all seen as signs from heaven that an emperor or a government has lost the mandate to rule. Think about it. Who can make an earthquake happen? Heaven. Floods? Heaven. Famine? Heaven. Those are not the sorts of things that humans have control over. So those would be seen, particularly by Chinese peasants, as signs from heaven that the current leadership deserves to be replaced. Also, losing the loyalty and support of the people. Okay, so if you're failing to meet the needs of your subjects, that's basically justification for them to rebel against you. And the rebellion itself would be a sign that you've lost the support of the people. And then losing a war. So if you have a series of wars going on and they're not going very well, there's a pretty good chance that's a sign that you've lost the mandate. So these are 4 specific ways, or 4 specific, let's say, characteristics that may occur that may reflect that an emperor or a government has lost the mandate. All right, so this is known as the dynastic cycle, okay? And basically what happens in a dynastic cycle is you start off with a nice new dynasty. New dynasties are great. They usually bring peace, they usually rebuild the infrastructure, they give land to peasants, and they protect the people. So when we say rebuild the infrastructure, I mean they rebuild roads and walls. They basically give peasants land so that they can farm, and it generally protects people from sort of bad things. Okay, so new dynasties are really good. And usually a new dynasty is led by someone who becomes the emperor because he was good, moral, and ethical and had the support of the people because he does these things. Okay, so over time, many generations will go by, and that's going to change the dynasty. So the problem is this: if you have an emperor and he's good, moral, and ethical, that's great. But his child, his son, a little bit of dad might rub off on him, and he might also be good, moral, and ethical as well. But by the time you get to the grandson, that starts to fade a little bit. So you get 4 generations out, and by the time you get to the great-grandson, he never knew the original founder of the dynasty. So all that good, moral, and ethical stuff that made him a good emperor in the beginning for the great-grandson isn't really there. In fact, the great-grandson was born the emperor. He never had to work hard at it. He didn't have to earn it. He had a sort of golden spoon in his mouth. And so he might not have the same qualities of being good, moral, and ethical that his great-grandfather might have had. So over time, after many generations, that new dynasty becomes an old dynasty. And what old dynasties start to do is do things like tax people too much. They stop protecting the people. They let the infrastructure decay, so the roads and the walls. They also treat people unfairly. In particular, they'll tax peasants a lot, but they'll give tax breaks to the rich and powerful, so that they can stay in power. So that's not very fair. And again, those are the sorts of things that are seen as being an old dynasty does that sort of thing. Okay, so what happens then is over time, if an old dynasty continues in that way, that old dynasty will lose the mandate of heaven. And how do they know that? Because what happens is problems will occur. Floods, earthquakes, famine, peasants' revolts, invaders attacking the empire, and bandits will start to raid the countryside. These are all really bad things that will start to take place, and people will interpret these as signs that the old dynasty has simply lost the mandate of heaven. Now, I want you to think about this for a second, particularly with floods, earthquakes, and famine. I can't make a flood happen. However, what I could do is I could build levees and dikes to prevent a river from actually flooding. Okay? Earthquakes. I can't stop an earthquake. However, I could have strict building codes that make it less likely that buildings would fall on top of people. And I can't stop famine. However, I could build granaries and store grain in those so that when there is a time for people who are hungry, I can open up the granaries and redistribute food. So I can't stop a flood, an earthquake, or a famine, but what good government can do is it can prepare for these things, and it can sort of prepare in a way that might lessen the problems of a flood, an earthquake, or a famine. That's not heaven, that's good government. And the problem is that old dynasties are spending their money, they'll raise taxes, but they'll spend the money building pleasure palaces for the emperor and not doing things like fixing the dikes or enforcing building codes or building granaries or protecting people by building walls. So again, it's all about how the old dynasty is going to use its power. If it uses it poorly, if it's not being moral, ethical, and good, then these problems are going to start to arise. Traditionally, though, the Chinese peasants have always seen these as signs from heaven. But essentially what we know is that they're really just signs of either good or bad government. Okay, so what happens at that point? The new dynasty might come along and claim the mandate of heaven. Why that happens is essentially peasants will revolt. A peasant army might rise up against the government. The leader of that peasant army might be a capable, strong, good, moral, and ethical guy. He'll lead people against a corrupt old government, and as a result, he'll have a lot of loyalty and support of the people. He'll claim the mandate of heaven, and he'll start his own dynasty. And that's when the cycle repeats itself. You start off once again with another new dynasty. The problem here, though, is that the cycle does repeat itself. So you can see, over time, the dynasty continues in that manner. And so throughout Chinese history, this process has happened again and again. So if I take a look at this, what I'm looking at is a sort of very simplistic timeline of Chinese history. And I can see that over 3,561 years, from the year, like over here, 1650, all the way up until 1911, which is when they had the Republican Revolution, I can see that in that time period there were many different dynasties in China. And each dynasty went through that dynastic cycle. Some of them were pretty short, like the Qin dynasty, which was only about 15 years. And then some of them were pretty long, like the Han dynasty, which was over 400 years. So some of these dynasties are short, some of them are long, But in either way, the dynastic cycle process generally happened. Keep in mind, this real Chinese timeline would be much more complicated than this, but this is a simplistic view of it. Also, I just want you to look at this as well. Here's where Columbus arrives in the New World in 1492, right during the middle of the Ming Dynasty. And the United States of America wasn't even formed until the Manchu or the Qing Dynasty. Okay, so this is important that you understand that from the perspective of people in the United States, we like to think that we're the best at government and we have the best system of government. But keep in mind, the Chinese have been doing government for much, much longer. All right, compare the numbers at the bottom. 3,561 years compared to 134 years. This is all up to 1911, but still, I think the Chinese have us beat in terms of understanding how government functions. This is the other way I want you to think about this. The Chinese don't think necessarily about time in the same process that we do when it comes to history. So we like to think that history goes in a nice straight line, just like the last timeline we looked at, right? It's linear. You have a starting point, an ending point. As people go through time, things get better. But the dynastic Chinese timeline sort of works more like this. Okay, think of it as like a series of, like a bed coil, if you were to stretch out a bed coil. And you can see the dynasties repeat themselves. Again, some are short, some are long, but the process is generally the same process. But it's a very different sort of conceptual view of how time might actually flow. In fact, here's a typical Chinese timeline, an outline of Chinese history across time. And you can see it's not the perfectly straight line that we usually see when we look at a Western style timeline. So again, the concept of time and the Chinese view of things is a little bit different. You can also notice that Chinese history is a lot more complicated than the timeline I showed you earlier. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. For the Shang and the Zhou dynasties are going to pretty much come to an end at a time period when China is basically living in what's known as the Warring States period. And this is going to be a time period that we'll look at a little bit later in the course. And just I want you to be aware that after the Shang and after the Zhou dynasties, China was sort of divided up and fighting amongst itself. But eventually one of these dynasties, this one here, the Qin, will conquer all of China and unite China under one Chinese empire, the Qin Dynasty. And that will be a topic that we'll explore in a later screencast.